The most haunting reality of Lake Trasimene was not the soldier fallen in combat, but the one who never saw an enemy. Pushed into the silt by the panic of his own lines, he discovered that 40 pounds of Roman iron makes it impossible to surface. Thousands vanished without a sound, standing upright beneath the water, swaying in the current while the lake above them turned dark and heavy. On the morning of June 21st, 217 BC, the known world dissolved into a suffocating, impenetrable white. For the 30,000 men of the Roman consular army, the sunrise brought no light, only a thick, heavy suspension of moisture that clung to the skin and turned the air into something solid enough to be felt in the lungs. They were marching along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, moving with the aggressive, rhythmic cadence of a force that believes it is the hunter. Yet the environment had stripped them of every advantage their discipline usually provided. The mist was absolute, a wall of damp gray that reduced visibility to the length of a spear shaft, isolating each legionary in a private, claustrophobic sphere of existence. A soldier could reach out and touch the shoulder of the man in front of him, feel the condensation slicking the bronze of a comrade's armor, yet be unable to see the centurion commanding the file. The visual cues that held a legion together, the standards, the hand signals, the reassuring geometry of the formation, were gone, replaced by a dull, muffled auditory landscape where sound traveled poorly and direction was a guess. The army was moving fast, driven by the furious impatience of Consul Gaius Flaminius, a man who viewed the silence of the morning not as a warning, but as an insult. He believed Hannibal was fleeing, terrified by the might of Rome, and that this fog was merely a nuisance, delaying the inevitable defeat of the Carthaginian invader. There were no scouts riding ahead because the consul had decided that speed was more vital than caution, a calculation based on the arrogance of a political mind that could not conceive of a trap large enough to swallow an entire army. The column stretched for miles along the narrow track, a serpentine beast of iron and leather squeezed tight between the invisible waters of the lake on their right and the steep, unseen slopes of the Cortona Hills to their left. The ground was soft, turning to a slick paste under thousands of hobnailed sandals, and the air smelled of wet wool, stagnant water, and the copper tang of unwashed bodies. It was a sensory deprivation tank constructed by nature, lulling the men into a trance of rhythmic motion, where the only reality was the mud beneath their feet and the gray void before their eyes. To the men in the ranks, the lack of enemy contact was interpreted as safety. They assumed the quiet was the quiet of an empty room, unaware that they were walking across the floor of a sealed chamber that was already occupied. They could not see the ridges looming above them in the whiteout, nor could they sense the 50,000 pairs of eyes watching their disorganized progress from the heights. The stillness was not an absence of danger, but the holding of breath before the strike. Every step took them deeper into the bottleneck, past the point of no return, guided by a geography that had been weaponized against them. The lake was passive, the mist was blinding, and the hills were waiting. The Roman army was not marching to battle. It was filing into a trap that had been prepared for them days in advance. And the lid was already being lowered, made not of stone, but of a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. To understand the magnitude of the impending collapse, one must first understand the seductive geometry of the Roman military mind. The 30,000 men marching into the mist were not merely a collection of soldiers. They were the components of a living, breathing machine designed to impose order upon chaos. The Republic did not conquer through individual heroism or the brilliance of a single sword arm, but through the brutal, mathematical certainty of the maniple system. This was a grid of flesh and iron, a checkerboard formation that allowed tired lines to retreat and fresh lines to advance, a perpetual motion engine of war that could grind down any barbarian horde through sheer attrition and discipline. To the tribunes riding in the column, The thick fog was an annoyance, but it did not negate the fundamental truth of their superiority. They believed in the physics of their formation the way a mason believes in the arch. As long as the lines held, as long as the commands were followed, the legion was an unbreakable solid. This faith in structure was their armor, a psychological shield far heavier and more impenetrable than the wood and bronze they carried on their left arms. At the head of this machine rode Consul Gaius Flaminius, a man whose confidence was forged not in the reality of the battlefield, but in the bitter furnace of Roman politics. He was a new man, a populist who despised the aristocratic caution of the Senate and viewed the religious omens of delay as the desperate grasping of old men afraid of losing their power. To Flaminius, the logic of the situation was crystalline and undeniable. Hannibal was a foreign invader cut off from his supply lines, a desperate gambler running out of luck. The smoke rising from the Etruscan farms in the distance was not a lure, but proof of a bandit army fleeing south, burning what they could not carry. The consul's strategy was driven by the fear that his political rival, Servilius, would arrive with the Second Consular Army and steal the glory of the final victory. Speed, therefore, was not recklessness. It was the only rational political calculation. By forcing a march along the narrow shores of the lake, Flaminius believed he was pinning Hannibal against the water, denying the Carthaginian cavalry the open plains they required to maneuver. The geography itself seemed to conspire to validate this fatal assumption. To the right of the marching column, the waters of Lake Trasimene provided a natural, unassailable flank, a liquid wall that meant the army only had to worry about the front and the left. The narrow path they navigated, squeezed between the water and the hills, was perceived as a tactical advantage, a funnel that would force any engagement to happen head-on, exactly where the heavy Roman infantry was invincible. The soldiers, blinded by the mist and deafened by the tramping of their own feet, took comfort in the proximity of their comrades. The density of the column felt like safety. The touch of a shoulder against a shoulder was a reminder that they were part of a singular, massive organism. They marched with the pilum, the heavy javelin, resting on their shields, confident that when the time came, the fog would lift, the trumpets would sound, and the machine would do what it had always done: turn the disorder of the enemy into a field of the fallen. They did not understand that their greatest strength, their rigid discipline, and their reliance on a centralized command structure was the very mechanism that had been targeted for destruction. They were walking into a scenario where the checkerboard could not be drawn, where the lines could not rotate, and where the singular brain of the consul would be cut off from the limbs of the army before a single order could be issued. The silence of the morning was not the silence of an empty world. It was the quiet of a trap that had been wound tight, waiting for the tension of the spring to reach its breaking point. The first fracture in the illusion of order appeared not as a dramatic event, but as a subtle, irritating corruption of the march's rhythm. For hours, the column had moved with the fluid, hydraulic consistency of water flowing through a pipe. But as the sun climbed higher behind the veil of mist, the flow began to stutter. In the vanguard, the rhythmic thud of hobnails on stone was replaced by the sporadic, muffled clatter of metal striking wood, a sound that drifted back through the fog like a rumor. The officers in the center of the line interpreted this not as the beginning of a battle, but as the friction of a minor skirmish, the expected resistance of a fleeing enemy's rearguard being overrun by the Roman advance. They believed the machine was working exactly as intended, grinding over an obstacle, and so they did not slow down. Instead, they pressed forward, eager to close the gap. However, the rear of the column, blind and deaf to the events at the front, continued to march at full pace, driven by the shouting of tribunes who were terrified of losing contact with the consul. The result was a dangerous compression, an accordion-like buckling of the line where the spacing between the maniples, the very lungs of the legion that allowed it to breathe and fight, was squeezed out of existence. Deep within the gray suspension of the lakeside track, the soldiers found themselves stopping abruptly, then rushing forward a dozen paces, only to slam into the backs of the men in front of them. The discipline that relied on precise intervals began to fray under the weight of physical annoyance. Men cursed the clumsiness of their comrades, shoving shields to create breathing room that the geography refused to grant. The air, already thick with moisture, grew heavy with the heat of 30,000 bodies jammed into a corridor that was becoming too narrow for their numbers. It was here, in the stagnation of the halt, that the first true anomalies began to register on the senses of the veterans. The silence of the hills to their left was unnatural. In a normal march, the displacement of birds and small animals would create a ripple of natural noise, the call of a crow, the rustle of brush. But the slopes rising into the whiteout were dead silent, possessing a stillness that felt manufactured. A few centurions, men who had spent decades reading the language of terrain, looked up into the opaque vapor and felt a prickling at the base of their necks, an instinctual alarm that had no logical source. They saw nothing but the swirling mist, yet the density of the air suggested presence, as if the empty space above them displaced a weight it should not have held. The baggage train, interspersed throughout the column, provided the most tangible evidence that the natural order was inverting. Mules, usually docile beasts of burden, accustomed to the noise of the legion, began to balk and bay, planting their hooves in the mud and refusing to advance. Their ears swiveled toward the invisible slopes, twitching at frequencies the human ear could not detect. The handlers goaded them, interpreting the animals' terror as stubbornness, forcing them deeper into the bottleneck. This struggle between man and beast created pockets of disorder that rippled outward, breaking the straight lines of the files and turning the organized march into a series of disjointed clumps. The smooth, serpentine beast of the Roman army was being chopped into segments, yet the command structure remained oblivious. The signals from the front, the trumpet blasts that should have organized the halt, were dampened by the heavy, wet air, reaching the center only as distorted, atonal bleats that conveyed confusion rather than authority. In this vacuum of information, the Roman mind filled the gaps with the most comfortable explanation available: incompetence. The soldiers believed the delay was caused by the baggage train getting stuck in the mud, or perhaps the consul up ahead was reorganizing the vanguard for a final push. They adjusted their armor, wiped the condensation from their faces, and complained about the weather, normalizing the disaster that was forming around them. They stood at ease, grounding their heavy shields in the mire, relaxing their muscles right at the moment they should have been tensing them. The false security of the crowd acted as a blinder. Because the man to the left and the man to the right did not look afraid, the individual soldier suppressed his own rising dread. They were waiting for the order to move, unaware that the delay was not a pause in the march, but the locking mechanism of a cage sliding into place. The sounds from the front grew slightly louder, a dull, grinding roar that sounded like surf on a rocky beach. But the mist softened the cries of the fallen into something that sounded deceptively like the labor of men clearing a road. The system was still technically intact, the ranks were technically formed, but the army had ceased to be a weapon and had become a target, standing patiently in the kill zone, waiting for permission to fall. The transition from an organized march to a catastrophic crush did not occur through a series of tactical maneuvers, but through a sudden, overwhelming seizure of the atmosphere itself. When the signal finally came, it was not a visual cue, but an auditory, physical blow, a guttural, collective roar from 50,000 throats that shattered the damp silence and caused the very air in the valley to vibrate against the skin. Before a single Roman eye could register a target, the mist on the left flank seemed to solidify and detach from the hills, transforming from a weather phenomenon into a cascading wall of Gallic heavy infantry and Numidian horsemen. The impact was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a kinetic collision between a stationary object and a falling mountain. The Roman column, stretched out for miles and blinded by the fog, was struck along its entire length simultaneously, a feat of timing that negated the concept of a front line. There was no flank to turn, no center to hold, because the entire army had become a single, exposed nerve. In those first critical seconds, the vaunted discipline of the legions attempted to engage, but the machinery of the Republic immediately ground its gears against the physics of the trap. Centurions, reacting with the ingrained reflexes of 20 campaigns, screamed the standard orders to face left and form a shield wall, but the commands were cruel abstractions in a space that no longer obeyed the rules of geometry. To form a line, a soldier needs room to draw his sword. To brace a shield, he needs footing. Here, there was neither. The sudden influx of the enemy compressed the Roman ranks with hydraulic force, shoving the outer files violently into the inner ones. The spacing between men, calculated precisely to allow for the rotation of tired soldiers with fresh ones, vanished instantly. The checkerboard formation, the tactical genius that allowed a legion to breathe and flex, fused into a solid, paralyzed block of iron and flesh. Soldiers found their arms pinned to their sides by the weight of their own comrades, their swords uselessly trapped in their scabbards, their heavy scuda pressed flat against their chests like the walls of a closing vise. The horror of the situation was strictly mechanical. The system was still trying to work, but its inputs were fatal. The men in the rear ranks, blind to the destruction happening 5 yards to their left, felt the surge and instinctively pushed back to maintain formation, unknowingly acting as the anvil for the Carthaginian hammer. This counter-pressure locked the men in the front ranks in place, stripping them of the ability to dodge, parry, or retreat. They were held static and upright by the crush of their brothers, while the Gallic longswords struck them down with the rhythmic efficiency of woodcutters. The fog, which had previously isolated them, now acted as a magnifier for the chaos, trapping the noise of the conflict within the corridor so that the cries of the fallen merged into a single, deafening frequency that drowned out all authority. Officers who tried to climb atop the press to direct the defense were pulled down or struck by javelins that emerged from the whiteout like hail, erasing the brain of the army while the body continued to spasm. As the pressure from the hills intensified, the entire Roman mass began to slide sideways, a slow, tectonic shift of 30,000 men being forced away from the slopes. The ground beneath them, churned into a slick paste of mud and mire, offered no purchase for the hobnailed sandals designed for firm terrain. The legionaries were no longer soldiers fighting a war. They were debris being swept along by a flood. The psychological break occurred when the men on the right flank, pushed backward by the crushing weight of the collapse, felt the ground turn soft and cold water seep into their boots. The realization rippled through the ranks not as a thought, but as a contagion of absolute terror. The lake was not a barrier protecting their flank, but a wall against which they were being crushed. The reassuring solidity of the formation had become a prison suit of bronze and leather, and the heavy armor that was supposed to make them invincible was now merely lifeless weight in a crowd so dense that the fallen could not drop. The breath was squeezed out of the legion, not by the enemy, but by the panic of its own density, and the retreat into the water began not as a choice, but as the only direction physics would allow the fading organism to flow. The destruction of the army entered its final phase not on the land, but in the gray, churning expanse of the shallows. Driven by the relentless pressure of the Gallic charge, the Roman line finally shattered, not into retreat, but into a desperate, liquid exile. Thousands of men, their minds broken by the claustrophobia of the crush, turned their backs on the hills and threw themselves into the lake, believing in the primitive logic that water was safer than steel. They waited out until the silt sucked at their knees, then their waists, then their chests, forming a new, bizarre formation of heads bobbing in the mist. Here, the discipline of the Legion made its last, fatal error. Even in the water, the instinct to clump together remained. Men sought the proximity of their fellows, creating dense clusters of floating armor that became perfect, immobile targets. They held their heavy shields above their heads to ward off the javelins raining down from the shore, but this active defense only exhausted them faster, their arms burning as they treaded water in 40 pounds of sodden wool and iron. The Numidian cavalry, seeing the prey trapped against the nothingness of the lake, did not hesitate. They rode their horses directly into the surf, the animals splashing through the darkened foam, their riders striking down at the exposed figures of the legionaries with the casual efficiency of fishermen harvesting catch. The Romans could not fight back. To lower a shield was to invite a spear. To raise a sword was to sink. They were suspended in a medium that denied them leverage, trapped between the impossibility of returning to the shore and the impossibility of swimming to safety. The water, which they had fled to as a sanctuary, became a viscous, suffocating blanket. Men who lost their footing in the soft clay bottom did not resurface. The weight of their lorica hamada, the chainmail shirt, dragged them under instantly, pinning them to the lake bed while their hands grasped futilely at the legs of their comrades above. The surface of the lake boiled with the struggle of the fallen, a chaotic mix of mire, water, and bronze, where the voices were cut short by the intake of dirty water. As the morning wore on, a new, silent strata of the battlefield began to form beneath the waves. The first men to vanish became the foundation for the next layer of horror. Their bodies, standing upright in the clinging mud or tangled in the reeds, formed a submerged obstacle course that snagged the living. Soldiers trying to keep their heads above water found their feet resting not on sand, but on the helmets and breastplates of the lost, a ghastly staircase of the fallen leading nowhere. The panic above the surface was frantic and loud, a cacophony of terror, but inches below, the silence was absolute. There, in the dim, filtered light of the underwater world, the legions of Rome stood in formation for the last time, swaying gently with the currents, their eyes open and staring into the murk, their mouths frozen in a silent gasp that no historian would ever hear. The lake accepted them without judgment, filling their lungs with silt, turning the elite heavy infantry of the Republic into a permanent, calcified reef of failure. The water level rose imperceptibly, displaced by the volume of the submerged army, as if the lake itself was swelling to consume the arrogance that had marched along its banks. When the sun finally burned through the remaining vapors at high noon, it did not bring the clarity of salvation, but the harsh, unforgiving light of a reckoning. The mist, which had acted as both an accomplice to the destruction and a shroud for the fading, evaporated to reveal a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by 3 hours of industrial force. The shores of Lake Trasimene were no longer defined by the boundary between earth and water. That line had been erased by a thick, dark slurry of mud and human ruin. The lake itself, usually a mirror of the Italian sky, had transformed into an opaque, metallic-scented stew that stretched for hundreds of yards from the bank. It lay flat and heavy, its surface tension broken only by the islands of floating shields and the drifting forms of horses that rotated slowly in the heat. The silence that settled over the valley was not the peace of nature, but a vacuum created by the sudden cessation of 50,000 voices, a void so profound that the buzzing of flies sounded like a roar in the ears of the survivors. Hannibal's troops, exhausted by the sheer physical labor of the conflict, moved through this field of ruin not with the jubilation of victors, but with the grim, methodical pace of gleaners. There was no resistance left to crush, no lines to break, only the harvest of the fallen to be collected. They waded into the murky shallows to strip the armor from the submerged legionaries, a task that required them to push aside the floating drift to reach the submerged men standing beneath the surface. It was a wet, grim work of salvage, pulling lorica hamata in bronze helmets from bodies that were already resting in the cold embrace of the silt. The looting revealed the terrifying intimacy of the Roman end. Men were found locked together in death, not in combat, but in the desperate clutches of drowning, dragging one another down in a final, panic-stricken pact. The victors found swords that had never been drawn, in pila that had never been thrown. The weapons of a superpower rendered useless by the simple, undeniable reality of the trap. The consul Gaius Flaminius, the architect of this disaster, was nowhere to be found. He had not merely been killed, he had been deleted. His body, stripped of its insignia and pressed into the anonymous mire by the hooves of the Gallic cavalry, was indistinguishable from the thousands of conscripts he had led into the mist. His disappearance was the final symbol of the catastrophe. The head of the army had been cut off and lost, leaving the Republic not only defeated, but leaderless. There would be no funeral, no urn returned to the family tomb, only the collective grave of the marshes. The streams running down from the hills, which would later be named Sanguinetto, the Red, carried the residue of the battle into the lake for days, a constant flowing reminder that the land itself was weeping. The geography had absorbed the legion so completely that the boundary between the soldiers and the soil had ceased to exist. As the afternoon wore on, the shockwave of the event began to travel outward, not as a sound, but as a terrifying absence. In Rome, the crowds gathering in the Forum would wait for news that would never come, until the praetor would finally climb the rostra and deliver the shortest, most devastating report in the history of the city. We have been defeated in a great battle. But on the shores of Trasimene, the history was already written in the stillness. The 15,000 men who lay lost in the water and the mud were not just casualties. They were the currency spent to purchase a lesson in hubris. The battle was over, the mist was gone, and all that remained was the sun beating down on a lake that had swallowed an empire's sons, hiding them in a silence that would last for 2,000 years. The fishermen who would return to these waters generations later would learn to dread the weight in their nets, knowing that the heavy drag from the bottom was not a catch, but the rusted, empty shell of a Roman soldier who was still standing guard in the dark, waiting for an order to march that would never come.